Ethan had just graduated from university and was stepping cautiously into the working world. If he were to sum up his story simply, he'd say he had landed a job through the usual grind, applications, interviews, and all that jazz. But the truth was, his life had recently taken a turn that was anything but ordinary. At times, it felt like a slice of soap opera drama had been dropped into his otherwise mundane routine. And honestly, he wasn't sure if it was something to brag about or something to keep under wraps. So here he was, putting his story out into the ether, hoping someone would listen, judge kindly, or maybe even offer a piece of advice. Ethan grew up in the sleepy market town of Ashbourne, nestled in the English countryside, where he was considered a bright kid. At school, he was known as the dependable one, the boy who did his homework, rarely caused trouble, and scored well enough to make his parents proud. When his A-level results came through, they were good enough to secure him a place at one of London's prestigious universities, Kingsbridge University, known for its historic campus and a steady stream of ambitious students. His parents were overjoyed but also deeply worried. Having been raised in Ashbourne all their lives, the idea of their only son suddenly moving to London, living alone in a flat miles from home, was terrifying for them. "You can't just throw him into the big city like that," his mother had said, wringing her hands. "What if he falls in with the wrong crowd? What if he's out late getting into trouble?" His father nodded solemnly in agreement, though Ethan had tried to argue for at least a dorm room on campus. But no, his parents refused, preferring a middle ground that felt safer. Ethan would live with his Aunt Margaret in a quiet suburb in West London. Aunt Margaret was a character in her own right. Tall, with sharp cheekbones and a presence that filled any room, she was the kind of woman who turned heads, though she never seemed to want the attention. She dressed with effortless elegance. Silk blouses that hinted at her slender neck, pencil skirts that hugged her hips just so, and heels that clicked authoritatively as she walked. Her jewelry was minimal but always meaningful. A delicate gold locket, a slender bracelet etched with tiny designs. There was a subtle, almost magnetic sensuality in the way she carried herself, a confidence tempered by a hint of melancholy that Ethan couldn't quite place. His parents trusted her to keep an eye on him, and she did just that, with a mixture of strictness and warmth. To Ethan, though, living with Aunt Margaret felt like living under a microscope. Friends were out at parties discovering themselves, while he tiptoed through a life that wasn't quite his own. The freedom he craved was always just out of reach, and though Aunt Margaret's hospitality was genuine, Ethan never felt at home. That Margaret's story was complicated. Years ago, she had almost married a man she thought she loved, only to discover he was already married. A revelation that had shattered her trust in love. The pain lingered beneath her polished exterior, visible only in brief moments when she thought no one was looking. Ethan had overheard fragments of her story, and while he didn't fully understand it, he sensed it had shaped the woman she was, a woman fiercely independent, yet quietly vulnerable. Despite her heartbreak, Margaret was a formidable presence at her job, a senior manager at a marketing firm. She commanded respect with her sharp mind and impeccable style. Yet, even with many admirers, she had never allowed herself to open up to anyone new. Ethan often wondered how she resisted temptation so gracefully, how she kept her heart so guarded. University life for Ethan was a whirlwind of lectures, assignments, and part-time jobs. His parents ran a small bakery back home, so financial strain was a constant undercurrent. While his peers lounged in cafes or went on weekend trips, Ethan was juggling tutoring gigs and late-night shifts to make ends meet. Even during his time in the Army Reserve, he managed to find odd jobs during leave, determined to ease the burden on his family. Aunt Margaret admired his resilience. "You're made of tough stuff, Ethan," she would say, her eyes softening. "But don't forget to live a little." He knew she worried about him, though she rarely voiced it. Their home life was a quiet one. Margaret rarely cooked for herself before Ethan moved in, preferring takeout or simple meals after long days at work. But with Ethan around, she started preparing dinners, simple but comforting dishes, sometimes leaving a roast on the table or setting out fresh vegetables. It was a small change, but it made the house feel more alive. Ethan appreciated the effort, even if he never asked why she had avoided cooking before. When Ethan started living with her, he felt caught between gratitude and guilt. His parents sent money to Margaret to help with expenses, though he only found out later. Now that he had a steady job, Ethan insisted on contributing, an offer that made Margaret laugh heartily. Never thought I'd be getting pocket money from my nephew, she joked, shaking her head. But she accepted it, and each payment felt like a small step toward independence. Despite the pressures, Ethan's first year at university flew by in a blur of work and studies. He made a few friends but never quite fit in. Relationships seemed like a distant fantasy, a luxury he couldn't afford emotionally or financially. Margaret noticed his loneliness and gently encouraged him to open up, but he was too focused on survival to heed her advice. One evening during the university's autumn festival, Ethan found himself reluctantly joining friends at a pub. He wasn't much of a drinker, and a couple of pints left him feeling dizzy and unsteady. On his way home, fumbling for his keys, he mistakenly entered the flat next door. The door swung open and a warm voice greeted him. Well, if it isn't the neighbor's wayward nephew. It was Mrs. Collins, the woman who lived next door. A lively middle-aged lady with a mischievous twinkle in her eye and a habit of wearing colorful scarves and floral dresses that swirled around her knees. Her bright red lipstick and sparkling earrings gave her an indefinable allure, a blend of charm and mystery. Ethan's face flushed crimson. Trying to cover his embarrassment, he joked, "Don't worry, Aunt Margaret. I'm just here to spoil you tonight." Mrs. Collins gave him a curious look, then burst out laughing. "Spoil me? With what? Your drunken ramblings." "You're a riot, young man." The awkwardness melted into shared laughter, and Ethan realized she was more than just a nosy neighbor. She was someone who might change the rhythm of his monotonous life. In the days that followed, their interactions became more frequent, each meeting layered with unspoken secrets and a growing, complicated connection. Margaret watched with a knowing smile, her eyes sparkling with something unreadable. Ethan's story was far from over. Beneath the surface of his quiet life in a West London suburb, a web of relationships and mysteries was beginning to unravel. And somewhere in the shadows an unexpected twist awaited. One that would challenge everything he thought he knew about family, trust, and the thin line between dependence and freedom. The damp London evening wrapped around Ethan like a heavy cloak as he stepped out of his modest office building in Ealing. The city's hum was a distant murmur beneath the steady drizzle. The kind of rain that didn't soak you but lingered. A ghost of wetness clinging to your clothes and moods. Ethan tugged the collar of his trench coat higher, his boots slapping softly against the slick pavements as he made the familiar walk to Aunt Margaret's house. It was a ritual he'd fallen into, returning to the sanctuary of her home, a place that felt less like a refuge and more like a carefully maintained stage where roles were played with polite precision. Margaret was waiting by the door, as usual, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of the hallway light. Tonight, she wore a deep emerald dress that hugged her slender figure, the fabric shimmering subtly with every step she took toward him. Around her neck hung the delicate gold locket he'd seen her wear countless times, catching the light just so. Her heels clicked softly on the wooden floor, a sound he'd come to associate with a comforting, if sometimes intimidating presence. "Long day?" she asked, her voice a low melody that seemed to smooth the rough edges of his thoughts. Ethan shrugged off his coat, the dampness clinging stubbornly. "The usual. Meetings, emails, coffee. Though I'm convinced the coffee is just a placebo at this point." Margaret chuckled, the sound rich and genuine. "At least you're keeping your sense of humor. Some people lose that by Wednesday." He grinned, feeling the tension of the day loosen just a bit. "If I lose it, I'll have to start emailing you for emergency jokes. Don't tempt me," she teased, leading him into the living room where the scent of freshly brewed tea mingled with the faint aroma of rosemary from the kitchen. "Sit down. I made your favorite lemon drizzle cake." Ethan's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You make cake? Since when do you bake?" Margaret smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Since I realized it's easier to lure you home with sugar than with stern lectures," he laughed, sinking into the plush armchair by the fireplace. The room was a blend of classic and contemporary. Mahogany bookshelves filled with a mix of leather-bound classics and modern novels, soft cushions in muted tones, and a large painting of the Thames at dusk hanging above the mantelpiece. It was a room that reflected Margaret herself. Elegant, layered, and quietly commanding. As they settled into an easy rhythm, the doorbell chimed softly. Ethan glanced toward the entrance, surprised to see Mrs. Collins standing there, her usual vibrant floral scarf wrapped snugly around her neck despite the rain. "Fancy seeing you here," Ethan said, masking his surprise with a casual smile. Mrs. Collins returned the smile, though her eyes held a flicker of something unreadable. "Thought I'd drop by. Heard there was cake involved. Margaret's lips twitched in amusement. You're always welcome, Joan. Come in before you catch a cold. Mrs. Collins stepped inside, her presence filling the room with a warmth that contrasted the chill outside. She wore a silky blouse that clung gently to her curves, paired with tailored trousers that hinted at a figure well cared for. Her red lipstick was bold, her laughter infectious. As the evening unfolded, the three of them found themselves wrapped in conversation that meandered from light-hearted banter to surprising confessions. Joan shared stories of her travels in her youth, tales that ranged from hilarious mishaps in Parisian cafes to quiet moments watching sunsets over the Cornish coast. Margaret spoke sparingly but with sharp wit, occasionally dropping a sarcastic remark that sent both Ethan and Joan into peals of laughter. Ethan felt a strange sense of belonging, a tether to two women whose lives seemed so different yet somehow intertwined with his own. The lines between family and friendship blurred, and for a moment, the loneliness that often shadowed him lifted. Later, as Joan prepared to leave, she turned to Ethan with a sly smile. You know, you're not as boring as you pretend to be. Ethan raised an eyebrow. I'll take that as a compliment. Joan winked. You should. And remember, the door's always open. Even if you mix up the keys again. As the door closed behind her, Ethan exhaled deeply, the weight of the evening settling in his chest. Margaret glanced at him, her gaze unreadable for a moment before she smiled softly. Life's full of surprises, isn't it? Ethan nodded, though inside a storm was brewing. That night, as he lay awake, fragments of conversation replayed in his mind. The laughter, the shared secrets, the subtle glances that hinted at stories untold. There was something about Joan's visit that felt like the opening of a door he hadn't known was locked. Outside, the rain continued its quiet patter against the windowpane, a steady rhythm that echoed the beat of his restless heart. He didn't yet know what awaited him, but he sensed that the delicate balance of his world was about to shift, pulling him into a mystery woven with desire, trust, and the fragile threads of family. And somewhere in the shadows a secret waited, one that could unravel everything. The morning light filtered hesitantly through the sheer curtains of Aunt Margaret's sitting room, casting a soft glow over the polished oak floor and the neatly arranged cushions on the faded velvet sofa. Ethan stirred awake in the armchair where he had dozed off the night before, the faint scent of Earl Grey tea still lingering in the air. His head throbbed slightly, the aftereffects of a late night and too much laughter, but there was something else, a restless energy that kept his thoughts swirling. Margaret had already risen, her footsteps light as she moved about the kitchen. Ethan could hear the faint clatter of dishes and the low hum of the kettle boiling. When she finally appeared, she was dressed casually in a cream cashmere sweater that hugged her slender frame and a pair of tailored black trousers. Her hair was pulled back loosely, strands framing her face delicately, making her look softer in the morning light. Yet no less commanding. Morning, she said, her voice calm but carrying a warmth that made Ethan's chest tighten slightly. Morning, he replied, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Didn't expect Joan last night. Margaret's lips curled into a knowing smile. Neither did I. But she's a good woman, even if she does have a penchant for showing up unannounced. Ethan chuckled, feeling the tension from the previous night ebb a little. She's different. I mean, she's got this energy like she's lived 1,000 lives and still isn't done. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Joan has her own battles just like the rest of us. Sometimes the loudest laughter hides the deepest scars. Ethan watched as Margaret poured 2 cups of tea, handing one to him. The warmth seeped into his hands, grounding him. Do you ever wonder, he began hesitantly, why you and Joan are so different? You both live alone, but you carry yourselves in such contrasting ways. Margaret sipped her tea slowly, her eyes distant. I suppose it depends on how you choose to live with your past. Joan embraces the chaos. I tend to keep it at arm's length. But neither of us is immune to loneliness. Before Ethan could respond, the phone rang, slicing through the quiet. Margaret glanced at the caller ID and frowned slightly. It's work, she murmured, standing to answer. Excuse me. The conversation was brief but tense. When she returned, her expression was unreadable. It's nothing serious, just some friction with a colleague. Workplace politics, you know how it is. Ethan nodded, but he sensed there was more beneath the surface. If you ever want to talk about it. Margaret gave a short laugh, a mix of amusement and resignation. Thank you, but I'm a professional. I can handle a bit of office drama. As the day unfolded, Ethan immersed himself in his own world. Emails, reports, and a never-ending stream of meetings. Yet, Margaret's troubles lingered in his mind like an unwelcome guest. That evening, he found her sitting alone in the dimly lit living room, a glass of red wine cradled in her hands. "You should be at that new restaurant opening with Joan," he teased gently, taking a seat beside her. Margaret's eyes twinkled faintly. "I'm not exactly the social butterfly she is. Maybe you just need the right company." She looked at him, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. The air between them thickened, charged with a tension that neither wanted to acknowledge but both felt deeply. Suddenly, Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time she didn't hesitate to answer. Her face hardened as she listened. Then she stood abruptly. "I need to go to the office tomorrow. Things are worse than I thought." Ethan's heart sank. "Do you want me to come with you?" She shook her head. "No. But thank you. I'll be fine." As she left the room, Ethan felt a mix of admiration and helplessness. The woman who seemed so invincible was battling demons behind closed doors. That night, sleep eluded him. Shadows danced on the walls, and his thoughts spiraled into questions that had no answers. What kind of battles was Margaret fighting? How much longer could she keep up the facade of strength? And then there was Joan, the enigmatic neighbor whose laughter still echoed in his ears. What role did she play in this delicate balance of lives? Ethan's world was shifting, the lines between family, friendship, and something more blurring with each passing day. The secrets lurking beneath the surface threatened to break free, promising revelations that could change everything. As dawn approached, a cold draft whispered through the window, carrying with it the promise of storms yet to come. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, the kind of London day where the clouds seemed to sag low, pressing down on the city like a leaden weight. Ethan stood at the window of Aunt Margaret's modest but impeccably kept home in Ealing, watching as pedestrians hurried by, umbrellas blooming like colorful mushrooms against the drizzle. He felt the dull ache of anticipation gnawing at his insides, a premonition that today would be different. Margaret was already dressed when he came down for breakfast. She wore a charcoal gray sheath dress that hugged her slender silhouette with subtle elegance, paired with a tailored black blazer that lent her an air of authority. Her dark hair was swept into a neat chignon, exposing the graceful curve of her neck, where the familiar gold locket rested against her skin. Her makeup was understated but impeccable, smoky eyes softened by a touch of rose on her lips. Even in the early morning light, she exuded a magnetic aura. Poised, unyielding, yet somehow vulnerable. "Coffee?" she offered, her voice steady but edged with fatigue. "Please," Ethan replied, taking a seat at the small oak kitchen table. The room smelled faintly of freshly ground beans and toasted bread. Margaret poured the coffee with practiced grace, then sat opposite him, her expression unreadable. "Today's the day," Ethan said softly. Margaret met his gaze. "Yes. I have to face it." The tension between them was palpable, a quiet storm gathering just beneath the surface. Ethan wanted to reach out to offer comfort, but the years of self-control and quiet dignity that defined Margaret made her seem untouchable. A fortress built of steel and silk. After breakfast, they left together in Margaret's sleek black sedan. The drive to the office was silent except for the soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers. The city blurred past in streaks of gray and amber, the hustle of morning commuters a distant backdrop to the weight pressing down on Ethan's chest. The office building, a glass and steel monolith nestled among the more historic facades of Chiswick, Margaret's demeanor shifted seamlessly from vulnerable aunt to commanding professional. She strode through the lobby with purpose, heels clicking sharply on the polished marble floor, her tailored coat billowing behind her like a cape. Ethan followed, a silent shadow. Inside the sleek, minimalist office, the atmosphere was tense. Margaret's usual calm was replaced by a steely resolve as she confronted the source of her troubles. A colleague whose subtle barbs and thinly veiled insults had escalated into outright sabotage. The man was slick, with a rehearsed charm and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ethan watched from the sidelines as Margaret held her ground, her voice measured but firm. She laid out her grievances with precision, refusing to be cowed. Yet beneath the surface, Ethan sensed the exhaustion, the toll that this daily battle was taking on her. After the meeting, Margaret's assistant approached with a new assignment, and Ethan caught a glimpse of the weary flicker in Margaret's eyes before she masked it with a professional smile. On the drive home, the tension between them eased slightly. Margaret's hand brushed briefly against Ethan's on the gearshift, a small gesture laden with unspoken meaning. He glanced at her, catching a fleeting softness in her gaze. Back at the house, Joan was waiting, her presence like a splash of color against the gray backdrop of the afternoon. She greeted them warmly, her smile wide and genuine, but Ethan noticed a shadow behind her eyes, a hint that she too was carrying burdens unseen. Dinner was a quiet affair, the three of them seated around the table laden with Margaret's carefully prepared dishes, a roasted chicken glazed with herbs, buttery new potatoes, and a medley of steamed vegetables. The conversation was light but tinged with an undercurrent of tension, the kind that comes from knowing that life is more complicated than it appears. After Joan left, Margaret lingered by the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the hallway light. She turned to Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for being here today." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth that chased away the chill of the day. Always. As he prepared for bed, Ethan's mind raced with questions and possibilities. The fragile equilibrium of their lives felt like a delicate glass ornament, beautiful but vulnerable to shatter at the slightest touch. And in the quiet darkness, a mysterious message awaited on his phone, an anonymous text that read simply, "Not everything is as it seems. Beware the shadows." Ethan stared at the screen, heart pounding. The game had changed. The rain tapped insistently against the windowpane, a steady rhythm that filled the otherwise still room where Ethan sat alone, the glow of his phone screen casting sharp shadows across his tense face. The message he'd received was cryptic but unmistakably a warning. Not everything is as it seems. Beware the shadows. His fingers hovered over the screen, unsure whether to reply, delete, or call Aunt Margaret or Joan. But something stopped him, an inexplicable chill that crept up his spine, as if the message had pulled back a curtain to reveal a darker stage behind the familiar scenes of his life. He glanced around the room, the dim light revealing the neat orderliness of Aunt Margaret's home, the polished mahogany bookcase, the carefully arranged cushions, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. It was a sanctuary, yes, but now it felt more like a set piece in a drama whose script he hadn't fully read. The following day dawned heavy with fog, the kind that wrapped London in a thick, gray blanket, muffling sounds and blurring edges. Ethan decided he had to find out who had sent the message. He started with Joan, the neighbor whose laughter had recently become a comforting refrain in his life. Perhaps she knew something or at least could offer some clue. He found her in her brightly decorated flat, the walls adorned with vibrant paintings and shelves crowded with books and trinkets collected from years of travel. Joan greeted him with her usual warm smile, dressed casually in a soft cashmere sweater and jeans, her red lipstick a cheerful contrast to the muted morning light. "Ethan, to what do I owe the pleasure?" she teased, pouring him a cup of tea that he hesitated, then decided to be direct. "I got a strange message last night. It said, 'Not everything is as it seems. Beware the shadows.' Do you have any idea who might have sent it?" Joan's eyes flickered briefly, a shadow passing over her lively features. She set down the teacup with a delicate clink. "That's unsettling. No, I haven't heard anything. But sometimes messages like that come from unexpected places." Ethan pressed her gently for more, but Joan shook her head. "Sorry, Ethan. If I hear anything, you'll be the first to know." Leaving Joan's flat, Ethan felt a growing unease. The warning seemed to echo in his mind, stirring questions about his aunt's workplace struggles, about Joan's own hidden depths, and about the delicate balance of his life. That evening, back at Margaret's house, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Margaret was unusually quiet, her usual poise tinged with weariness. She wore a silk blouse in a muted shade of burgundy that complemented her pale skin, the fabric clinging softly to her curves, hinting at the strength beneath her composed exterior. Her eyes, sharp and penetrating during the day, now held a flicker of vulnerability. Ethan watched her as she prepared dinner, the kitchen filled with the rich aroma of garlic and rosemary. The way her slender fingers moved deftly, chopping and stirring, revealed a grace that belied the turmoil beneath. He wanted to ask about the message, about the shadows, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he offered a small smile. "You cook well," he said softly. Margaret glanced up, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she returned the smile. "Thank you. It's one of the few pleasures I allow myself." Their shared silence was comfortable but charged, a delicate dance of emotions neither dared to name. Later, as Ethan was about to retire, a sudden knock at the door startled him. Opening it revealed a courier holding a plain brown envelope. There was no return address, Only his name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. He closed the door carefully, heart pounding, and tore open the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, grainy but unmistakable. It showed Margaret standing outside her office building, speaking to a man Ethan didn't recognize, his face partially obscured by shadows. Scribbled on the back were the words, "Trust is a fragile thing." Ethan's mind reeled. Who was the man? What was their connection? And why was he being drawn into a web of secrets that threatened to unravel everything? As he stared at the photo, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening, whispering of betrayals and lies yet to be uncovered. The balance of his world was tipping, and Ethan knew that the next steps he took would lead him deeper into a mystery far more dangerous than he had ever imagined.